On the morning of June 19th, 1944, at 0730 hours, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stood on the flag bridge of the aircraft carrier Taiho, watching radar operators plot incoming contacts on their screens. The ship beneath his feet was Japan's newest fleet carrier, commissioned just 3 months earlier. Her armoured flight deck held 73 aircraft. Taiho represented the entire remaining technological hope of the Imperial Japanese Navy. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Ozawa had reviewed the intelligence estimates the night before. Task Force 58, the American fast carrier task force approaching from the east, fielded 15 carriers. 15. The number made no sense within any framework Ozawa understood about naval operations and logistics. Japan's entire carrier force assembled for this battle consisted of 9 ships. The Americans were deploying a single task force larger than Japan's entire operational carrier strength. But the numbers that truly kept Ozawa awake were different. His 9 carriers embarked 450 aircraft total. That was less than half their designed capacity. Japan simply didn't have enough aircraft to fully equip its carriers. Worse, the pilots flying those aircraft averaged 6 months of training. Some had only 3 months. Before the war, Japanese carrier pilots trained for 2 years before their first combat deployment. The Americans approaching from the east operated 15 carriers with over 900 aircraft embarked. Intelligence reports suggested American pilots averaged 2 years of training and 300 hours of flying time. Many were combat veterans with experience from Tarawa, the Marshalls, Truk, and dozens of smaller engagements. Ozawa understood what those numbers meant. They meant Japan was about to fight a battle it had already lost. Before the first aircraft launched, the shooting would continue for 2 days. Hundreds of men would die. But the outcome was decided by mathematics, training pipelines, and industrial capacity established years before anyone fired a shot. The question that haunted Ozawa was simple and unanswerable. How did the Americans build a fleet this large? More specifically, how did they train enough pilots and produce enough aircraft to operate 15 carriers simultaneously, while also maintaining Atlantic operations, training commands, and replacement pipelines? Japan entered the war with the most powerful carrier force ever assembled. 6 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. All modern, all battle-tested. The pilots were the best trained in the world. 2 years of instruction before their first carrier landing. Navigation, gunnery, formation, flying, night operations, carrier approaches. They practiced until perfection became routine. American carrier pilots in December 1941 averaged 9 months of training. Some had barely 200 hours of flying time. They could take off and land. They could operate their aircraft systems. But they lacked the combat experience and tactical sophistication that came from years of preparation. On paper, Japan should have dominated carrier warfare for years. The Americans had 7 carriers total in December 1941, split between the Pacific and Atlantic. Japan had 11 operational carriers. Numerical superiority, tactical superiority. 2 decades of carrier doctrine development refined through combat in China, but paper lies. By June 1944, something had changed so fundamentally that the war's outcome was no longer in question. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was not about whether Japan could win, it was about how long Japan could delay the inevitable. The transformation began in January 1944 with the creation of Task Force 58. The designation was deliberate. When Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the 5th Fleet, the fast carriers became Task Force 58. When Admiral William Halsey took command and the designation changed to 3rd Fleet, the same carriers became Task Force 38. Same ships, same commanders, different designation. The dual designation confused Japanese intelligence. Reports came in describing massive American carrier forces operating under different task force numbers. Were these separate formations, different ships, or was the American Navy somehow rotating its carrier strength so rapidly that new task forces appeared before old ones left the operational area? The truth was more disturbing than any deception. The Americans had so many carriers that they could rotate entire fleet staffs while keeping the same ships continuously operational. Admiral Spruance would take command with his staff, plan an operation, execute it, then return to Pearl Harbor to plan the next campaign. Meanwhile, Admiral Halsey and his staff would take the same ships and conduct the next operation immediately. No downtime, no pause for reconstitution. Continuous operations across thousands of miles of ocean. The organizational capacity alone exceeded anything Japan could replicate. The carriers themselves told the story of how industrial capacity determined naval power. In January 1944, Task Force 58 departed Pearl Harbor with 12 carriers, 7 Essex-class fleet carriers and 5 Independence-class light carriers. By June, the force had grown to 15 carriers, 7 Essex-class fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, over 900 aircraft. Each Essex-class carrier displaced 27,100 tons, larger than any Japanese carrier except the massive converted battleship Shinano, which wouldn't commission until November. The Essex-class carried 90 aircraft. Taiho, Japan's newest carrier, carried 75. But the numbers revealed something more disturbing than individual ship comparisons. In January 1944, Task Force 58 had 12 carriers. 4 months later, it had 15. The Americans were adding carriers to their operational force faster than Japan could train pilots to fly from the carriers they already had. How? The answer started years earlier, with decisions about industrial mobilization, training infrastructure, and organizational systems that compounded over time. By 1944, those decisions had created a self-reinforcing system that produced carriers, aircraft, and pilots at rates Japan could not match regardless of courage, tactical skill, or fighting spirit. Consider the training pipeline. An American naval aviator in 1944 received instruction at one of dozens of facilities across the United States. Pre-flight training lasted 3 months, primary flight training another 3 months, operational training specific to fighters, dive, bombers, or torpedo bombers took an additional 4 to 6 months. Total training time exceeded 1 year. Flying hours before first combat deployment averaged 200 to 300 hours. Japan's training program in 1944 compressed this timeline to accommodate losses that exceeded replacement rates. Pilots graduated to fleet squadrons after 6 months of training, some deployed after 3 months. Flying hours before first combat averaged 100 hours. Many pilots had significantly less. The difference wasn't incompetence or lack of dedication. Japanese instructors worked as hard as their American counterparts. Japanese trainees were as motivated as any pilots in history. The problem was systemic. Japan lacked the fuel to sustain extended training flights. They lacked the instructors because experienced pilots were needed at the front. They lacked the training aircraft because production priorities favored combat models. American training facilities operated without these constraints. Fuel was abundant. Instructors were plentiful because the pilot production pipeline generated enough graduates that experienced aviators could be rotated to training commands without depleting frontline strength. Training aircraft were available because American industry produced more planes than combat operations could absorb. By 1944, the United States operated over 100 flight training facilities. Naval Air Station Pensacola alone graduated thousands of pilots annually. When combined with facilities in Corpus Christi, Jacksonville, Miami, and dozens of smaller bases, the system produced approximately 15,000 new naval aviators per year. Japan operated 6 major flight training facilities, with capacity for approximately 2,000 pilots annually. Even working at maximum capacity with shortened training cycles, Japan could not produce enough pilots to replace combat losses and expand carrier air groups simultaneously. The mathematics were absolute and unforgiving. American pilot production exceeded Japanese production by 7 to 1. Combat attrition favored the Americans because their aircraft were more survivable, their pilots better trained, and their doctrine more refined. The gap widened with every battle. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, the exchange ratio was roughly equal. Both sides lost carriers, Both sides lost aircraft and pilots at comparable rates. The battle was tactically inconclusive. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, the exchange ratio began shifting. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers. The United States lost 1. Japanese aircraft losses exceeded 240. American losses totaled 150. The exchange ratio was roughly 1.6 to 1 in America's favor. At the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942, the ratio shifted further. Japan lost 70 aircraft. The United States lost 25, approximately 3 to 1. At the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October 1942, Japanese losses reached 99 aircraft, including 69 experienced pilots. American losses totaled 74 aircraft, with fewer pilot casualties due to better rescue operations near American-controlled waters. The exchange ratio approached 1.3 to 1. By June 1944 at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the ratio had become catastrophic. Japan would lose 350 aircraft. The United States would lose 130 aircraft. The exchange ratio had reached nearly 3 to 1 in aircraft losses, and far higher in pilot casualties, because Japanese pilots had no armor protection and American rescue operations saved downed aviators that Japanese forces could not recover. These ratios reflected cumulative advantages that compounded over time. American aircraft were superior. The F-6F Hellcat fighter outperformed the A-6M0 in almost every category except maneuverability, speed, climb rate, diving speed, protection, armament. The Hellcat was faster, tougher, and more heavily armed. American pilots were better trained. 2 years of instruction versus 6 months. 300 hours of flying time versus 100 hours. Combat experience versus first deployment. American doctrine was more refined. Fighter sweeps cleared enemy airspace before strikes. Combat air patrols protected the fleet from incoming attacks. Radar-directed intercepts brought fighters into position before enemy strikes arrived. American logistics were more robust. At-sea replenishment allowed continuous operations without returning to base. Replacement aircraft and pilots flew to carriers at sea. Damaged carriers could be repaired and returned to action within weeks. Every advantage multiplied every other advantage. Superior aircraft made pilots more survivable. Better training made tactics more effective. More effective tactics reduced friendly losses and increased enemy casualties. Lower friendly losses meant more experienced pilots accumulated more combat time. More combat experience made future operations even more successful. The cycle reinforced itself. American carrier aviation got stronger with every battle. Japanese carrier aviation got weaker. The gap that started small in 1942 became absolute by 1944. Vice Admiral Ozawa understood this on the morning of June 19th. He had studied the intelligence reports. He knew American carrier strength. He knew Japanese pilot quality had declined. He knew the battle about to begin would not turn out well. But understanding the problem and solving it were different things. Japan couldn't train more pilots. They lacked the fuel. They lacked the instructors. They lacked the time. Japan couldn't build better aircraft faster than they were being shot down. Industrial capacity limited production. Combat attrition exceeded replacement rates. Japan couldn't expand carrier strength to match American numbers. The carriers sitting in Japanese waters couldn't operate because Japan lacked the aircraft and pilots to equip them. Building empty carriers solved nothing when the aircraft production and pilot training couldn't fill them. The Americans faced no such constraints. Task Force 58 operated 15 carriers in June 1944. By early 1945, during the Iwo Jima campaign, the task force would field 18 carriers. By July 1945, during operations off Japan, 17 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers. 23 carriers total. Over 1,500 aircraft. 23 carriers. Japan's entire carrier force, at its peak wartime strength, had been 14 ships, never all operational simultaneously. The Americans were deploying individual task forces with more carriers than Japan's entire navy had possessed at maximum strength. The disparity wasn't limited to numbers. American carriers were individually more capable. They carried more aircraft. They had better radar. They had superior anti-aircraft armament, with proximity-fused shells that detonated automatically near targets. They had better damage control with trained teams and redundant systems that kept ships operational after damage that would sink Japanese carriers. USS Franklin was hit by 2 bombs on March 19, 1945, while operating off the Japanese coast. The bombs penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, triggering secondary explosions from fueled and armed aircraft. 724 men were killed. The ship was dead in the water, listing badly, burning with magazines threatening to explode. Franklin did not sink. Damage control teams fought the fires. They stabilized the list. They got the engines running. Franklin sailed to Pearl Harbor under her own power. From Pearl Harbor, she transited to the Brooklyn Navy Yard for repairs. The ship survived, damage that would have destroyed any Japanese carrier. This level of damage control was impossible for Japan. Japanese carriers hit by major attacks usually sank. Japan lacked the repair facilities. They lacked the replacement parts. They lacked the trained damage control teams. They lacked the organizational depth that let American carriers survive catastrophic damage. The fundamental difference was industrial capacity and how that capacity translated into operational capability. The United States could absorb losses, repair damage, replace casualties, and return stronger than before. Japan could not. Every loss was permanent, every casualty irreplaceable. Every damaged ship reduced total fleet strength permanently. By the morning of June 19, 1944, these accumulated differences meant the Battle of the Philippine Sea was decided before it began. Ozawa's 450 aircraft faced over 900 American aircraft flown by better-trained pilots in superior aircraft, supported by better radar and better anti-aircraft defenses. The mathematics were absolute. No amount of courage or tactical brilliance could overcome such fundamental disadvantages. Japan would fight, because fighting was all that remained, but victory was impossible. At 0730, radar operators on American carriers detected the first wave of incoming Japanese aircraft at 150 miles. Fighter directors began vectoring Hellcats to intercept. The battle was beginning. What happened over the next 9 hours would demonstrate conclusively that wars are won in training facilities and factories long before they're decided in battles. Industrial capacity matters more than tactical skill. Organizational systems matter more than individual courage. The side that can train more pilots, produce more aircraft, and operate more carriers wins regardless of how bravely the other side fights. Japan had brave pilots. Japan had experienced commanders. Japan had sophisticated tactics developed over decades. None of it mattered when facing an enemy with 900 aircraft to your 450. When facing pilots with 300 hours of training versus your 100 hours. When facing aircraft that were faster, tougher, and more heavily armed than anything you could produce. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was not a battle where one side outfought the other. It was a mathematical demonstration of what happens when industrial capacity determines military outcomes. Japan lost 350 aircraft. The United States lost 130. The ratio was nearly 3-1. But that ratio understated the true disparity. Of Japan's 450 aircraft committed to the battle, 300 were shot down and 50 more crashed attempting to land on carriers after dark. Japan lost 78% of its aircraft. The United States lost 14%. American carriers returned to full operational status within hours. Japanese carriers that survived limped back to base with shattered air groups that could never be reconstituted. 3 Japanese carriers were sunk. 0 American carriers were lost. The battle demonstrated that by mid-1944, American carrier aviation had reached a level of superiority that made traditional naval combat obsolete in the Pacific. Japanese surface forces couldn't operate within range of American carriers without being destroyed. Japanese bases couldn't function within range of American carriers without being neutralized. Japanese supply lines couldn't operate within range of American carriers without being severed. The Pacific War had become a war of American carrier aviation, methodically destroying Japan's capacity to resist, while Japanese forces watched from behind defensive perimeters that shrank daily. Industrial capacity had determined the outcome. Everything else was aftermath. Ozawa stood on Taiho's bridge and watched his aircraft launch into the rising sun. He knew what would happen. The intelligence reports had made it clear. Task Force 58 held advantages Japan could not overcome. But orders were orders. The aircraft launched. The battle began. 28 minutes after the first aircraft launched, at 0858, an American submarine torpedo hit Taiho on the starboard side. The damage should have been manageable. One torpedo, one hole. Japanese damage control doctrine was adequate for this type of hit. But a young damage control officer made a critical error. He ordered the ship's ventilation system turned on to clear gasoline fumes from the hangar deck. The ventilation system spread the fumes throughout the ship instead of venting them overboard. 6 hours later, a spark ignited the gasoline vapor. The explosion tore the ship apart. Taiho sank in minutes, taking 1,272 men with her, 32 months to build. 3 months in service. Gone. The battle continued, without Taiho. Japanese aircraft continued attacking. American fighters continued shooting them down. By nightfall, on June 19th, Japan had lost 3 carriers and 300 aircraft. The United States had lost 29 aircraft. The disparity told the complete story of how industrial capacity determined the war's outcome. One side could build carriers faster than the other could sink them. One side could train pilots faster than the other could shoot them down. One side could produce aircraft faster than combat could destroy them. That side won, not because they fought harder or smarter, not because their commanders were more brilliant or their tactics more sophisticated. They won because they built more ships, trained more pilots, and produced more aircraft than the enemy could match. Industrial capacity won the Pacific War. Everything else was commentary. The morning after the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American intelligence officers aboard the carriers began analyzing the results. They counted aircraft shot down. They reviewed gun camera footage. They interviewed pilots who had returned from strikes against the Japanese fleet. The numbers were so lopsided that some officers initially questioned their accuracy. 346 Japanese carrier aircraft destroyed on June 19th alone. Another 97 land-based aircraft shot down. Total Japanese losses for the day exceeded 440 aircraft. American losses totaled 29 aircraft in air-to-air combat. The exchange ratio was 15-1. No battle in the history of naval aviation had produced such one-sided results. The Americans dubbed it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. One pilot compared it to hunting turkeys back home. The enemy aircraft were slow, poorly flown, and fell from the sky in large numbers when engaged by experienced Hellcat pilots. The comparison was accurate but incomplete. This wasn't a turkey shoot. This was the final demonstration that Japan's carrier aviation had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The battle destroyed not just aircraft but irreplaceable pilots. Experienced aviators died. Partially trained pilots died. The few remaining veterans from Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Midway died. By the evening of June 20th, Japan's carrier force retained fewer than 100 operational aircraft. Most pilots were dead or missing. The 3 carriers that survived had shattered air groups that could never be reconstituted, because Japan no longer had the pilots or aircraft to replace them. Task Force 58 suffered 130 aircraft losses total over 2 days. Most were operational losses. Pilots ran out of fuel returning from long-range strikes and ditched in the ocean. American destroyers and submarines rescued most of them. Within days, replacement aircraft and replacement pilots arrived from rear area bases. The carriers returned to full operational strength. The disparity revealed the fundamental difference between the 2 carrier forces. American carriers operated within a system that could absorb losses and regenerate strength continuously. Japanese carriers operated without such support. Every loss was permanent. This system advantage traced directly back to decisions made years before the war began about how to structure industrial mobilization and training infrastructure. The Americans built systems that could scale. The Japanese built forces that could not expand beyond initial capacity. Consider pilot training. The United States Navy established its primary flight training system at Naval Air Station Pensacola in 1914. By 1941, the facility had trained thousands of pilots over nearly 3 decades. When war came, the Navy expanded the Pensacola system by creating duplicate facilities across the country. Naval Air Station Corpus Christi opened in 1941. Naval Air Station Jacksonville expanded in 1942. Naval Air Station Miami increased capacity. Dozens of smaller facilities for primary training, intermediate training, and operational training opened across the United States. By 1944, over 100 flight training facilities operated continuously. Each facility processed hundreds of students simultaneously. Instructors taught standardized curriculums. Training aircraft were abundant because production exceeded combat consumption. Fuel was available because American oil production dwarfed consumption. The system produced 15,000 new naval aviators annually. That was more pilots than Japan's entire naval air force at its peak strength. American pilot production in 1 year exceeded Japan's total pilot inventory, accumulated over 2 decades of naval aviation development. Japan could not replicate this system. They lacked the facilities. They lacked the instructors because experienced pilots were needed at the front. They lacked the aircraft because production could barely replace combat losses. They lacked the fuel because American submarines were sinking tankers faster than Japan could import oil. By 1944, Japanese pilot training had collapsed to abbreviated programs that produced marginally qualified aviators. 6 months of training, 100 hours of flying time, minimal tactical instruction, no advanced doctrine, just enough training to take off, fly in formation, and attempt to attack enemy ships. These pilots faced American aviators with 2 years of training and 300 hours of flying time. The outcome was predetermined by the training differential alone. Add superior American aircraft and superior American radar direction, and the battle became a slaughter. The same pattern applied to aircraft production. American industry produced aircraft at rates that seemed impossible by Japanese standards. Republic Aviation produced over 15,000 P-47 Thunderbolt fighters. Grumman produced over 12,000 F-6F Hellcat fighters. Douglas produced over 10,000 SBD, Dauntless dive bombers. Chance Vought produced nearly 13,000 F-4U Corsair fighters. Total American aircraft production exceeded 300,000 aircraft during the war. Fighters, bombers, trainers, transports, everything. The factories operated around the clock with workers who had never built aircraft before the war, but learned assembly line techniques that made mass production possible. Japan produced approximately 76,000 aircraft total during the war. That included all types: Army aircraft, Navy aircraft, trainers, everything. American production exceeded Japanese production by 4 to 1. In combat aircraft specifically, the ratio was closer to 5 to 1. The production gap meant American forces could sustain operations continuously while absorbing losses that would have crippled Japan. Lose 100 aircraft in a battle? Replace them within days from reserve stocks. Replacement aircraft arrived by escort carrier from the United States. Replacement pilots flew out from rear area bases. Operational strength returned to 100% within a week. Japan lost 100 aircraft and could not replace them for months. Production could not keep pace with consumption. Pilot training could not replace casualties. Operational strength declined with every engagement and never recovered. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The carrier construction story followed identical patterns. American shipyards built carriers using mass production techniques adapted from cargo ship construction. Prefabrication, modular assembly, standardized components. Workers with minimal experience could build complex ships because the process was broken down into simple, repetitive tasks. Newport News Shipbuilding built most Essex-class carriers. The Yard specialized in fleet carriers, but learned from Henry Kaiser's cargo ship techniques. They started prefabricating carrier components. Hull sections built in separate shops, flight deck sections assembled in dedicated facilities, propulsion modules tested before installation. When assembly time came, Cranes lifted complete sections into position. Workers welded them together. The process was faster than traditional ship construction and required less skilled labor. An Essex-class carrier took 14 to 16 months from keel laying to commissioning. Japanese carriers of comparable size took 30 to 44 months. The Americans were building fleet carriers twice as fast as Japan, and they were building more than twice as many. By the time Taiho commissioned in March 1944, the Americans had 17 Essex-class carriers in service or under construction, 17 to 1. Japan commissioned Taiho after 32 months of construction. In the same period, American shipyards commissioned 6 Essex-class carriers. The production rate differential meant every Japanese carrier that entered service was immediately outnumbered by American carriers that had entered service during the same construction period. The mathematics made victory impossible. Japan could not build carriers fast enough to replace losses and expand the fleet simultaneously. The Americans could do both. American carrier strength grew continuously from 1943 through 1945. Japanese carrier strength declined after Midway and never recovered. By October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japan's carrier force had effectively ceased to exist. The carriers that survived the Philippine Sea had no aircraft. Japan committed them as a decoy force to draw American carriers away from the main battle area. 4 carriers sailed north with minimal air groups. Zuikaku, the last survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack force, carried approximately 30 aircraft. The other 3 carriers were nearly empty, 108 aircraft total across 4 carriers. That was fewer aircraft than a single American Essex-class carrier could deploy. The decoy worked. American carriers took the bait and sailed north to engage the Japanese carriers, but the sacrifice achieved nothing. American escort carriers in Leyte Gulf fought off the Japanese surface fleet anyway. The decoy operation cost Japan its last carriers for no strategic gain. Zuikaku sank on October 25, 1944. She was the last of the 6 carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor. She had survived 3 years of combat. She survived the Coral Sea, the Eastern Solomons, the Santa Cruz Islands, and the Philippine Sea. She sank at Leyte Gulf not because American attacks were particularly effective, but because Japan no longer had enough aircraft or pilots to defend her. The end of Zuikaku marked the end of Japanese carrier aviation as an effective fighting force. Japan still had carriers. Some were under construction. Some sat in port unable to operate because they lacked aircraft and pilots. But none could conduct meaningful operations against American forces. The Americans ended 1944 with 27 fleet and light carriers operational. They would add more in 1945. By the war's end, over 30 carriers operated in the Pacific. Task forces with 15 or 20 carriers struck targets across Japan with impunity. Japanese air defenses were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The final carrier ratio told the complete story. Japan entered the war with 11 operational carriers. Japan built 17 carriers during the war, including conversions and new construction. Total Japanese carrier inventory reached 28 ships, though never more than 14 were operational simultaneously. The United States entered the war with 7 carriers. The United States built 110 carriers during the war, including fleet carriers, light carriers, and escort carriers. Total American carrier inventory exceeded 117 ships, with over 30 operational simultaneously at peak strength. The ratio was approximately 4 to 1. 4 American carriers for every Japanese carrier. But that ratio understated the true disparity, because American carriers were individually more capable, carried more aircraft, had better radar, better anti-aircraft defenses, better damage control, and operated within a logistics system that kept them at sea continuously. Adjusted for capability rather than raw numbers, the effective ratio was closer to 10 to 1. 10 American carriers' worth of combat power for every Japanese carrier's worth. That level of superiority made naval combat one-sided. Japanese surface forces couldn't operate. Japanese air forces couldn't defend. Japanese supply lines were severed. The war became a siege of Japan itself. Vice Admiral Ozawa survived the Battle of Ozawa, the Philippine Sea. Taiho sank, but Ozawa transferred his flag to another ship and continued commanding the remnants of Japan's carrier force. He commanded the decoy force at Leyte Gulf. He watched Zuikaku sink. He returned to Japan with no carriers, no aircraft, and no pilots. After the war, Ozawa was interviewed by American naval intelligence officers, documenting Japanese operations. They asked him when he knew Japan had lost the war. Ozawa said he knew in March 1944, when Taiho commissioned and intelligence reports confirmed American carrier strength. Taiho was Japan's only new fleet carrier in 32 months. One carrier. The Americans had commissioned 17 fleet carriers in the same period. The numbers made victory impossible. Simple mathematics. Japan could not build ships fast enough, train pilots fast enough, or produce aircraft fast enough to match American rates. The intelligence failure wasn't in collection. Japanese intelligence knew American carrier numbers. They knew American pilot training throughput. They knew American aircraft production figures. The raw data was available from multiple sources, including prisoners of war, technical publications, and reconnaissance. The failure was analytical. Japanese planners could not conceive of an enemy that mobilized the way America did. They looked at American numbers and assumed they were exaggerated or temporary. They assumed American expansion would peak and decline. They assumed industrial limits would constrain American growth. Every assumption was wrong. American mobilization never peaked. Industrial capacity continued expanding. Pilot training throughput kept increasing. Aircraft production kept rising. Ship construction kept accelerating. The Americans were not approaching limits. They were building systems that compounded growth over time. By 1944, these systems had created advantages Japan could never overcome. The training pipeline produced more pilots than combat consumed. The industrial base produced more aircraft than battles destroyed. The shipyards produced more carriers than enemy action could sink. American carrier aviation became a self-reinforcing system that got stronger with every battle. Better pilots survived because of better training and better aircraft. Survivors accumulated experience that made future operations more successful. Success reduced friendly losses, which meant more experienced pilots stayed in service longer. Greater experience made tactics more effective, which reduced losses further. The cycle reinforced itself continuously. American carrier strength grew geometrically rather than linearly. By mid-1945, Task Force 38 operated 23 carriers with over 1,500 aircraft. That was more carrier power than every other navy in the world combined, including Britain, Japan, and all other combatants. Japan had nothing to counter it. The carrier force was gone. The pilots were dead. The aircraft were destroyed. American carrier strikes ranged freely over Japan, hitting airfields, factories, ports, naval bases, anything that moved. Japanese air defenses were overwhelmed. Japanese fighters were outnumbered 20-1 or more. The war ended on August 15, 1945. Japan had commissioned 6 fleet carriers during the war, plus conversions and smaller vessels. America had commissioned 24 Essex-class fleet carriers plus 9 Independence-class light carriers, plus over 75 escort carriers. Over 100 carriers total. The final ratio was approximately 18-1, 18 American carriers for every Japanese carrier built during the war. That ratio told the complete story of how industrial capacity determined the Pacific War's outcome. Japan fought with honor. Japan fought with determination. Japan had brilliant commanders and sophisticated tactics. None of it mattered when facing an enemy with 18 times the term, carrier production, 5 times the aircraft production, 7 times the pilot training throughput, and unlimited industrial capacity to sustain all of it continuously for years. The lesson extended beyond World War II. Industrial capacity matters more than tactical brilliance. Organizational systems matter more than individual courage. The ability to train replacements matters more than initial quality. The capacity to absorb losses and regenerate strength matters more than avoiding losses through skillful defense. Japan entered the war with the finest carrier force in the world, built over 20 years by the most experienced naval architects and shipbuilders in Asia, operated by pilots who trained for 2 years before their first carrier landing. supported by tactics refined through combat in China. America entered the war with an untested carrier force, pilots with less training, unproven doctrine, limited experience. But America had something Japan could not match: the ability learn, adapt, and scale production to levels that seemed impossible. By 1943, American carriers were better than Japanese carriers. By 1944, American pilots were better trained than Japanese pilots. By 1945, American carrier aviation had become the most powerful naval force in history, not because Americans were inherently better warriors, but because American systems compounded advantages over time, while Japanese systems could not expand beyond initial capacity. The title of this story captures an essential truth. Japanese forces couldn't believe one American carrier task force had more aircraft than their entire fleet. When Task Force 58 appeared with 15 carriers and 900 aircraft, Japanese commanders thought intelligence reports were wrong. 15 carriers in a single task force was impossible. 900 aircraft concentrated in one operational area violated everything they understood about logistics and naval operations. But the reports were accurate. The Americans were operating carrier task forces with more combat power than Japan's entire navy, and they were operating multiple such task forces simultaneously. Task Force 58 in the Central Pacific. Task Force 38 would relieve them. Escort carrier groups supported amphibious operations. Training carrier groups prepared new air groups stateside. The scale was unprecedented in naval history. No nation had ever concentrated such power at sea. No navy had ever deployed such numbers continuously. The British Royal Navy at its peak in World War I never operated forces comparable to American carrier strength in 1944. This was industrial capacity expressed as naval power. Steel production, aircraft manufacturing, pilot training infrastructure, logistics networks, damage control systems, repair facilities, everything required to sustain carrier operations continuously across thousands of miles of ocean for years. Japan could not match any element of this system. They tried. They built carriers as fast as their limited steel production and shipyard capacity allowed. They trained pilots as fast as their constrained fuel supply and instructor availability permitted. They produced aircraft as rapidly as their factories could operate, with limited raw materials and machine tools. Every effort was insufficient. The gap widened with every month. By mid-1944, the disparity had become absolute. One American carrier task force had more aircraft than Japan's entire remaining carrier force. That single sentence summarized everything about why Japan lost the Pacific War. Not because Japanese sailors lacked courage, not because Japanese commanders lacked skill, not because Japanese tactics were inferior. Japan lost because American industrial capacity produced carrier aviation on a scale Japan could not imagine, let alone match. The mathematics were simple and brutal. More carriers meant more aircraft at sea. More aircraft meant more strikes against enemy forces. More strikes meant more enemy losses. More enemy losses meant greater American advantage in future battles. The cycle reinforced continuously until Japanese resistance collapsed under the weight of numerical superiority so overwhelming that skill and courage became irrelevant. By July 1945, American carrier task forces operated off Japan with 17 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers, 23 carriers total, over 1,500 aircraft. They launched 1,000 aircraft strikes against Japanese cities. Japanese air defenses were overwhelmed. Japanese fighters were outnumbered 50-1. The war ended not because of atomic bombs, though those provided a convenient excuse for Japanese leaders to surrender. The war ended because Japan had no military capacity left to resist. Carrier aviation destroyed that capacity. Carrier production created the carrier aviation that won the war. Henry Kaiser, the dam builder who knew nothing about ships, revolutionized shipbuilding by applying mass production techniques. Newport News Shipbuilding learned from Kaiser and cut carrier construction times in half. Thousands of workers, many of them women who had never held a wrench before 1942, built carriers in months that should have taken years. Together they built a fleet that overwhelmed Japan through sheer industrial power. Not because any individual ship was perfect, not because any individual pilot was invincible, but because the system produced so many ships and so many pilots that individual losses became statistically irrelevant. Task Force 58 could lose 20 carriers and still operate effectively, because replacement carriers were already under construction. American carrier aviation could lose 1,000 pilots and regenerate strength within months, because training facilities produced that many graduates every 6 weeks. Japan could not absorb such losses. Every carrier sunk was irreplaceable, given construction timelines. Every pilot killed was gone forever given training constraints. The side that could absorb losses won. The side that could not absorb losses lost. The title wasn't hyperbole. Japanese forces truly couldn't believe one American carrier task force had more planes than their entire fleet. The numbers violated everything they understood about naval operations and industrial capacity. But the numbers were real. The task forces were real. The aircraft were real. And that reality, more than any battle or any strategy or any tactical innovation, determined the outcome of the Pacific War. Industrial capacity won. Everything else was commentary. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.